It's now time to take a look at one of the most important elements of an ABAP program, and that's dealing with internal tables. Now, you've already covered tables in the ABAP dictionary, and we've sort of hinted at internal tables throughout this course, but we haven't really dug deep into what they are, how we use them, and the syntax, and that's what we're going to do right now. If you are planning on writing any ABAP programs at all, or reading ABAP programs and really understanding them, you've got to understand internal tables. Because just about every program uses them. And you have to learn both the old method of using internal tables with header lines, as well as the newer method of using separate work areas. Why do we have to learn both? Well, SAP has been around a long time. And there are still a lot of programs in the system that use the old method of using header lines with internal tables. So when you're trying to recode, you've got to understand how they work. But when you're creating your own code, you want to use the newer method of creating separate work areas. And this will also make it easier when you move on to understanding ABAP objects. Now, internal tables only ever exist when your program is running. They're internal to a running program only. When you write your ABAP program, you specify the structure for an internal table, and you write your program to make use of it. And once your program finishes using the internal table, it is then destroyed. When you start to use internal tables in your programs, you will see that they behave exactly the same way as structures that you define in your program. These structures are called work areas. The only difference is that your structures have only one line, whereas an internal table can have an unlimited number of lines, just like a normal database table. So let's ask ourselves, what is the use of an internal table? Well, internal tables are used for an awful lot of things in our programs. They allow us to hold results of calculations that we can use later on in our program. They allow us to hold records of data that we can access really quickly instead of having to read data from database tables over and over again, and a whole host of other reasons. Now, internal tables are really flexible because they can be defined using any number of other defined structures. This allows you to have many normal table structures grouped together and placed into one internal table. If you're familiar with other programming languages, think of multi-dimensional arrays. You will see as we work with internal tables that the basic form consists of a table body, which is all the records within the table, and then we have a header record. Now remember, the header record means we're working with the older style internal table. But for the newer style, we would have the table body and a separate work area, defined exactly the same structure as the table, but it is kept separate and works separately. Now flipping back to the older method, the header line or work area is used when we read individual records from our internal tables. And what do I mean by this? Well, when we read a record for the older style table, that record gets placed into the header record that we can access directly. For the newer style table, we read a record into a work area, very similar to a header record, but remember it's separate. And also when we want to add records to an internal table, for the older style, we place the contents into the header area. For the newer style, we place contents into the work area, and then we transfer the header record or work area into the body of the internal table, which results in us creating a new record. During this course, we have introduced the table statement, which we used to declare an ABAP dictionary data table that we wanted to work with. Now, internal tables are a little bit different in that we have to declare the internal table ourselves. And whilst we do this, we must declare if we want to use a header line as our work area or a separate work area. As I've mentioned before, you'll find that old SAP programs often use a header line with their internal tables. But today it's best practice to use a separate work area. You see, using a header line has several restrictions, and when SAP introduced the possibility to work with internal tables without header lines by using our own work areas, we were given the ability to create multi-dimensional tables, which, as I mentioned before, with the multi-dimensional arrays, it's just tables within tables. Now, we're not going to dig that deep into multi-dimensional tables in this course, but just bear in mind this can be done, and you'll find it used an awful lot. Now, I mentioned earlier that internal tables can have an unlimited number of records. Well, I told a bit of a white lie there. There are some restrictions. The architecture of an SAP system limits the size of our internal tables to around 2 GB in size. You will also need to bear in mind just how powerful your specific SAP system is. Take into account the hardware, the operating system, the amount of memory there is, and so on. Even though we can create internal tables up to 2 GB in size, it's best practice to keep them as small as possible, because if you have multiple programs taking up so much memory in your system, you'll run the risk of making your whole system run really, really slow. And the last thing you want is a basis guy coming up to you saying, "Why is your program taking up so much memory? You're causing everybody else's programs to run really slow." And the last thing you want is users complaining, because then you start getting some earache.